Hello, this is Kylie with Fem and Flow. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we are continuing the series called The Hijacked Blueprint. It's no secret that what we call history has been inverted and rewritten for manipulation and control. The question is, if the history books are changed, how many generations does it take for the truth to be forgotten? In this series, we rewrite history through Gnosis. What we're doing in this series is tracing a thread most of us were never taught to see. In the last episode, we talked about the origin of inversion. Today, we will go from ancient wisdom traditions that lived in direct connection with Source to the rise of spiritual suppression, to how that blueprint was preserved in secret and eventually seeded into a place called America. This is not the version of America we see now, but a sacred experiment meant to restore divine coherence on Earth. By talking about this, we are taking back the blueprint and calling forth memories of what we've always known, but maybe couldn't quite name. This episode begins with the Earth connected mystics, the ones who remembered how to live in direct relationship with the land, the sky, the stars, and the divine. In the last episode, where I talked about the origin of inversion, I ended it saying the original codes were not lost. They went underground, kept alive by mystics, Gnostics, Essenes, Templars, Druids, and the sacred feminine herself. They weren't just preserving information, they were preserving a frequency, a living current of remembrance passed not only through scrolls or stone, but through blood, breath, and embodied memory. This current is what we now call Gnosis. Gnosis is not belief, Gnosis is direct knowing. It's what remained when the temples fell, when the books were burned, when the priesthoods fractured. It's what was whispered in caves, sung in rituals, hidden in symbols, and carried through the wombs of women who still remembered. Gnosis was not lost, it was just veiled. And now, as the spiral turns again, Gnosis is rising back to the surface. So let's start with the word gnosis. It comes from the Greek word meaning knowledge, but it doesn't mean knowledge in the intellectual sense. It means direct inner knowing. Gnosis is what happens when you don't need a priest to talk to God for you, when you don't need a temple because your body becomes the temple, when you don't need dogma because your intuition is already speaking truth. Gnosis is enlightenment. It's what happens when your soul reconnects to God energy directly, when you remember the original design of creation. It's not automatically having all of the answers, but it's living in the frequency where these answers live. Everything I talk about on this podcast, the architecture of coherence, white hole reality, true tone embodiment, the point of all of it is to lead you back to Gnosis, back to coherence, back to the true you. The version of you in full coherence with God energy, absolutely vibing in higher dimensional energy, which is your birthright. Gnosis is not a spiritual luxury. It's not a rare talent for mystics and saints. It's our natural state. It's the way reality naturally works in a white hole universe, where divine energy flows clearly, where source is available, where truth is felt before it's spoken. Here on Earth, in this inverted matrix, Gnosis seems rare. It seems mystical, but only because we've been taught to look outside ourselves. In truth, Gnosis is always available. It's not something bestowed upon a few gifted people. It's a return to what you already are. Ancient mystics across the world accessed this kind of knowing. The Druids of the Celtic world, the sages of Egypt, the early Gnostic Christians who saw Christ as an inner template rather than a distant god, the Essenes who lived as a sacred community of initiates. This was the lineage of Yeshua or Jesus and Mary Magdalene, deeply steeped in mystical Judaism and likely practicing forms of early Kabbalah. And then the Kabbalist of mystical Judaism, the Sufis, like Rumi of Islam, dancing into divine union through poetry and movement, and the shamans and medicine people of every indigenous culture on earth. In different ways, all of these traditions were describing the same thing. The divine is not something you find outside of yourself. It's something you awaken within. And that was a very dangerous idea for empire, and very dangerous for the inverted false matrix controllers, the group I call the dark global elite. So now let's focus first on the earth mystics of Europe, the Druids and the pagan traditions. The Druids were the priestly class of the Celtic people. They were astronomers, judges, storytellers, herbalists, spiritual initiates. They didn't write things down. They transmitted knowledge through oral memory, rhythm, ritual, and the land itself. They were deeply attuned to ley lines, star alignments, plant intelligence, and the wheel of the year, a living seasonal rhythm that mirrored cosmic order. The Druids didn't write their teachings down because they understood that true wisdom is alive. It was meant to be transmitted through presence, voice, and experience. Oral tradition allowed their knowledge to stay dynamic, adaptable to time, place, and energy. This wasn't unique to the Druids. Many Gnosis-led groups across cultures shared sacred teachings orally. Indigenous Native Americans passed down star knowledge, plant medicine, and creation stories through storytelling and ceremony. Mystic Jewish lineages preserve deep spiritual insight through memorized parables and encoded language. Other wisdom traditions did the same. They did so because Gnosis isn't just information, it's frequency. And frequency is best transmitted through living breath, not just written words. So now let's swing back to the Druids. They didn't live in isolation. They were the spiritual stewards within the broader pagan world, a world rooted in earth reverence, seasonal celebration, and a direct relationship to life. Where pagans lived in tune with the land through ritual and communal cycles, Druids functioned as the keepers of cosmology, ethics, and energetic law. Both received their knowledge the same way, through Gnosis, direct communication with the natural world and coherence with God energy. They didn't learn through books or institutions. They got this information through vibrational relationship with earth, sky, body, and source. They would enter states of resonance with the forest, the stones, the stars, and receive truth. But it didn't come as new information. It came as remembering, as if something already encoded within them was being reawakened. It wasn't being studied, it wasn't being taught, it was being recalled. This is the essence of Gnosis. It bypasses the mind and speaks directly to the soul. You don't learn it, you recognize it. It resonates. That's why so many of us feel a deep sense of homecoming when we hear certain truths. It's because they were never foreign to begin with. They were just sleeping under the surface, waiting for resonance to bring them back online. And what's amazing is this. While the Druids were doing this in what we now call the British Isles and France, other mystic lineages were having the same experience in totally different places with different words and symbols, but arriving at the same core truth. In the Middle East, the Essenes, a mystical Jewish sect, were practicing intentional community, ascetic purification, and direct communication with divine intelligence. Both Yeshua or Jesus and Mary Magdalene were Essene initiates, raised in a lineage that emphasized inner light, energetic integrity, and sacred embodiment. So, I just mentioned ascetic purification. Ascetic purification refers to spiritual or physical purification practices rooted in asceticism, a disciplined, minimalist lifestyle aimed at detaching from material desires, bodily pleasures, or worldly distractions in order to purify the soul and draw closer to the divine. Ascetic purification wasn't about punishment. It was about tuning the body into a sacred instrument, clearing interference so the signal from source could come through more clearly. In nearly every mystical tradition, from the Essenes to the yogis to the Sufis, this kind of purification was seen not as a suffering. This kind of purification was seen as sacred preparation for receiving the divine directly. Ascetic purification was about quieting the noise, creating stillness in the field, freeing the nervous system from overstimulation, and sharpening inner sensitivity to hear the tone of God more clearly. While some ancient traditions or practice celibacy, it also can look like eating in alignment with frequency, tending to the fascia and body, clearing the mind so the signal of truth can come through, avoiding alcohol or other substances, letting go of patterns that dull the field, and getting time in solitude. And just to tie this back with other episodes on the podcast, this completely correlates to what I talk about when I say our body is our electromagnetic vessel, and it's how we operate in this physical experience and how we create our reality. And it goes with our body needs to be this sacred instrument that is actually able to harness, anchor in, and hold this higher vibrational energy. So many people across the globe are saying the same thing, just in different words. Later, the Gnostic Christians would carry these teachings forward, seeing Christ as a template of divine consciousness within every person, not as a far off savior. To them, salvation wasn't about blind faith or institutional loyalty. It was about awakening to your own divine nature through Gnosis. In parallel, the Kabbalists of mystical Judaism were mapping creation through the tree of life, a fractal system of divine emmanuation that showed how spirit becomes form, how light becomes matter, and how we ascend back through coherence. Their practices involved breath, chant, and inner vision, designed to restore the original pattern of divine flow. Even Sufi mystics of Islam were spinning into union with the beloved, accessing ecstasy, poetry, and pure love through movement and devotion. None of these groups were copying each other. They were often separated by continents, languages, and lifetimes, but they were tapping into the same source, using different words to describe the same direct experience of the divine within. And like I said, Gnosis is enlightenment. It's what happens when the veil lifts and you remember what was always true. It's how your system naturally functions in a white hole reality, when you're not blocked by inversion or suppression. All of the things I talk about on this podcast, the architecture of coherence, light body activation, or what I call white hole embodiment, breath, fascia, true tone are the equation of Gnosis in motion. They're not special spiritual tricks. They're not exclusive to gurus or mystics. They are the natural state of the body, field, and soul when you are aligned. And in a white hole universe, this is normal. It's only here in this false matrix that Gnosis seems rare. But it is extraordinary, but not because it's rare. While mystical traditions across the world practice ascetic purification as a way to open the soul to God, the Roman Empire was building something very different. A system not rooted in inner truth, but in external authority. Before Christianity and the Roman Catholic Church, Rome followed a polytheistic state religion. They worshipped a pantheon of gods like Jupiter, Mars, and Venus, adapted from the Greeks. Temples were built, sacrifices made, and festivals held. And it wasn't out of devotion. It was to keep society in order. The gods weren't necessarily personal guides. They were tools of empire. The divine was something to appease for military success, agricultural prosperity, and social control. Eventually, emperor worship was introduced. Emperors like Julius Caesar and Augustus were declared divine. Citizens were expected to offer allegiance. And it wasn't just to the government, but to the god status of the emperor himself. In other words, Rome didn't just want to rule the land, it wanted to rule meaning. It created a prototype or a microcosm of the inverted false matrix, where power comes from top down instead of from within, where the soul is not sovereign but subordinate, where access to God is mediated through ritual, state approval, and hierarchy. That's why Gnosis, this direct inner connection to the divine, was so threatening. Because if you don't need a priest, a temple, or an emperor to reach God, then you also don't need Rome. You don't need Caesar. You don't need a state-sanctioned religion to tell you what is true. And that was dangerous. So the Roman strategy was clear. Absorb, then invert. And the strategy is something I've been talking about through this whole podcast and on many different episodes. I talk about how the dark does not create anything new. They take what is sacred and then subtly weaponize it. They subtly invert it. They take what's true, leave some of the resonating factors, and then invert other parts for control and manipulation. Absorb, then invert. That is their entire strategy. They absorbed early Christianity, which began as a mystical, inner path tradition rooted in Essene teachings, Kabbalistic symbolism, and direct communion with divine energy. It was never meant to be a religion of control. It was a way of being, a path of inner transformation, a blueprint of Gnosis. But Rome saw the power in that and decided to weaponize it. They took the Christic message of empowerment and Gnosis and rebranded it into a state religion. But before I get into what the Roman Empire did, let me back up to early Christianity. Let's talk about Yeshua and Mary Magdalene, because the version most of us were taught has been heavily distorted. Yeshua was not preaching blind obedience or external worship. He was demonstrating divine embodiment. He wasn't saying he alone was the Son of God. He was saying we all are, that the kingdom of heaven is within, that our bodies are temples. that we each hold the spark of God, and we can remember how to live in full coherence with that divine source. Mary Magdalene wasn't a sinner or passive follower. She was his equal, his partner, and a powerful spiritual initiate in her own right. She carried the Christic codes in her womb, both energetically and literally. Together, they were modeling a sacred union template rooted in balance, embodiment, and gnosis. They were teaching how to reconnect directly to God, how to activate the light body, how to bring the divine into form, how to awaken what we now call the 12-strand DNA, a full spectrum spiritual architecture that reconnects the human system to source intelligence. This wasn't abstract theology. It was vibrational practice. It was living gnosis. It was liberation. But that message was too powerful for empire. If people knew they could access God directly, they wouldn't need priests or temples or rulers. They wouldn't be controllable. So the teachings were burned, the feminine was erased, the embodiment message was replaced with sacrifice, guilt, and hierarchy. Instead of "you are the temple," we got "you are a sinner." Instead of "you are a child of God," we got "only He is the Son." Instead of "activate your light," we got "suffer and obey." But here's what actually happened. Yeshua was put on a cross to be crucified because he was spreading truth and gnosis. But he didn't actually die. He entered a deep state that appeared lifeless, but it wasn't death in the final sense. He was taken down, recovered, and went on to live for about 30 more years. During that time, he traveled, taught in private, and continued his mission in quieter, more protected ways, far from the eyes of empire. Yeshua's death was not a sacrifice. It was a demonstration of what becomes possible when the spiral is fully stabilized, when you are fully embodied with source coherence. The crucifixion was not the point. The resurrection was. When your DNA is fully online, when your Merkaba spins in harmonic balance, you cannot die. The body becomes light, the form transfigures. You return through resonance. This was a white hole coherence event, anchored through his body, through his union with Mary Magdalene, and their shared polarity field they created together. It opened a portal in the grid that has remained encoded ever since. And he was around 30 years old at the time of crucifixion, and we'll talk about the relevance of this in the next episode. So after the crucifixion, some traditions say he traveled east to India, Kashmir, or Tibet to continue his teachings and deepen his mastery. Others say he stayed close to the Mediterranean world, with Mary Magdalene eventually traveling to southern France to preserve the sacred teachings. Either way, the core idea is this. The real teachings of Christ didn't die with him. They kept spreading through the hearts of those who carried the Gnosis. And that is what made the Roman Empire so afraid. They couldn't kill the blueprint, so like I said, they tried to absorb and invert it. So then between 100 and 300 AD, there was the rise of Gnostic Christianity and the battle for truth. As the movement spread, many groups interpreted Christ's teachings through a mystical lens. These were the Gnostics. The Gnostics taught that salvation came through gnosis, or inner awakening, not through external worship or blind faith. They emphasized the divine feminine, Sophia, Christ as a consciousness template, not just a historical figure, and direct access to God. This posed a huge threat to the Roman imperial control. So, early Christians were heavily persecuted by Rome, imprisoned, tortured, and executed in public arenas. And I'm going to give a specific example, but I'm going to swing back to it because I need to give a little more background information. In 312 AD, Emperor Constantine claimed to have a vision of the cross before battle, converted to Christianity, at least politically, and stopped the persecution. But this was not a spiritual awakening, it was a political move. In 325 AD, Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea. This was one of the most pivotal moments in the hijacking of the Christic stream. At this council, a group of bishops under imperial influence decided which books would go into the official Bible and which ones would be destroyed or hidden. They were not choosing based on spiritual purity. They were choosing based on political alignment, on what would reinforce Rome's authority and suppress spiritual autonomy. The Gnostic Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, were excluded. Why? Because they emphasized inner light, divine union, and personal empowerment. They portrayed Mary Magdalene not as a prostitute or a follower, but as a high initiate, the spiritual equal and partner of Yeshua. They spoke of the kingdom of God as something within, not a place ruled by priests or emperors. And these truths were dangerous for Roman control. So Rome rebranded the Christic message as a state religion, and in doing so, created what we now call the Roman Catholic Church. They inverted sacred truth into an empire tool, something to organize, control, and manipulate humanity. Yeshua's resurrection was reduced to atonement theology, the idea that he died for our sins, that suffering was divine, and that we must be saved through guilt, worship, and blood. When he was rebranded as a necessary sacrifice, the people were taught to revere death instead of life, to outsource their power instead of embody it. Magdalene was removed entirely and her teachings were erased. Her role as feminine Christ was stripped away, and the sacred union that made resurrection possible was shattered from the collective field. This was the moment the Christ codes became distorted in perception. Yeshua and Mary Magdalene, showing embodiment of the divine blueprint, was inverted into sacrifice. They didn't come to save humanity. They came to show humanity who they really are and to remind them what becomes possible when divine tone is fully embodied. Yeshua did not die for our sins. He died and returned to demonstrate what a fully awakened DNA template could do. His Merkaba body activated, his light body reassembled, his frequency surpassed physical limitation because his cellular structure was fully aligned with source tone. This threatened the system, so they absorbed and inverted it in order to remain in control. One of the deepest consequences of this inversion was the splitting of the divine union. By erasing Mary Magdalene and severing the feminine Christ from the narrative, the balance of sacred polarity was broken. The union of Yeshua and Magdalene wasn't just a romantic relationship, it was a spiritual template, a living demonstration of how masculine and feminine energy in full coherence creates resurrection, coherence, and divine creation. When you remove the feminine from that equation, everything collapses into imbalance. Over time, this fracture played out across culture, religion, and society. The feminine current, intuition, flow, embodiment, emotional intelligence, and inner knowing was pushed underground. What replaced it was a rigid structure of patriarchal dominance, both in spiritual doctrine and daily life. We see this most clearly in how many religious traditions began teaching that men should lead spiritually and that women should submit to their husbands. These teachings aren't just outdated, they're inverted. They take divine polarity and flip it into hierarchy. But here's the truth. In divine union, the feminine leads energetically, not because it's more powerful, but because it moves first, like the tone before the structure forms. The feminine is the current of creation, the frequency of source. The masculine then responds to that tone and brings it into form. This isn't about gender, this is about energetic order. When feminine energy leads, whether in a man or a woman, it sets the tone for coherence. The masculine energy then grounds that tone into structure, into direction, into movement. But when the masculine tries to lead without the feminine setting the frequency, it disconnects from source. It becomes controlling, rigid, and disconnected from the divine flow. That's what happened in the Roman inversion. The feminine was silenced. The masculine was cut off from the current. And over centuries, that turned into systemic patriarchy, institutional religion, and spiritual suppression disguised as order. To restore coherence, we must restore divine polarity. We must let the feminine lead again, not just in culture, but in our bodies, our choices, and our energy fields. We must listen to tone before action, frequency before form, presence before direction. And this is the return of sacred union. It's not just between people, it's also within ourselves. And it begins by remembering what was erased and choosing to embody it again. While there wasn't a single founding day, the Roman Catholic Church was effectively established between 325 and 380 AD, crystallizing its power over the next few centuries. This wasn't the church Yeshua envisioned. It was a control grid built on top of his name. The Vatican was established as the spiritual capital of this new empire. And here's where it gets even deeper. And I've talked about this before. The Vatican sits on a major ley line, a powerful energetic meridian in Earth's grid system. These points are energetic acupuncture points, where energy flows more powerfully and where human intention can shape collective resonance. But remember, energy is neutral. It can be used to open gateways of light or to consolidate control. The Vatican, like other key sites around the world, became a place where dark energetic rituals were performed. These rituals are not just symbolic. They are designed to distort the Christic field, to invert divine codes, and to keep the collective in a state of spiritual amnesia. But to fully understand the scope of this inversion, we have to zoom out. Because the hijacking didn't start with Christianity. It started before with the inversion of Judaism itself. So let's talk about the inversion of the Hebrew tradition. Long before Yeshua walked the earth, the Hebrew people had a deeply mystical relationship with the divine. The original Israelite traditions were far more animistic, symbolic, and vibrational than most people realize. The Hebrew language itself was not just phonetic, it was vibrational technology. Each letter carried numerological and energetic resonance. The name of God, Yahweh, was considered unutterable because it encoded a breath-based frequency, not just a name. And that is YHWH. So just sit here and take a big inhale and exhale. This name was considered unutterable because it was more like a breath or vibration, a tone that couldn't be fully captured with the human voice. YH is the inhale, WH is the exhale. To even deepen this, the YH inhale is the divine masculine energy, structure, seed, spirit. The WH exhale is the divine feminine energy, flow, womb, manifestation. This inhale and exhale together is breath and creates divine polarity. The full breath cycle encoded into Yahweh or YHWH is a sacred union of masculine and feminine, a spiraling, living frequency of creation. Tone precedes form, and creation emerges through harmonized polarity. This suggests that the name of God was not meant to be uttered because it already is, through the breath of every living being. It's not something you say, it's something you become attuned to. To breathe the name of Yahweh in its fullness is to restore the feminine, the body, the earth, the flow, the truth of two becoming one, the truth of sacred, balanced polarity. And earlier, when we talked about Yeshua and Mary Magdalene, we talked about the truth of their own sacred union and their own field of balanced polarity. Over time, this truth of Yahweh was distorted. Instead of understanding Yahweh as a sacred breath pattern, a living tone of creation, we were told not to use the name of God in vain. But even that became part of a fear-based narrative. It wasn't about honoring the sacred. It became about guilt, shame, and control. Rather than teaching people to embody the breath of God, the message became, be afraid to speak it. Don't get it wrong, stay small, stay silent. The original reverence was replaced by superstition. The living tone was buried under dogma. And what was once about union and embodiment became about hierarchy and fear. Early Hebrew spirituality was rooted in direct communion with God, with prophetic visions, sacred feminine imagery, and a fluid oral tradition. Some even honored Asherah, a divine feminine consort to El or Yahweh, who appeared in early inscriptions and household shrines. This was a more relational, embodied, and earth-connected form of spiritual life. But over time, especially after the Babylonian exile, which was in the 6th century BCE, a shift occurred. A trauma of exile led to a centralization of religious power. The fluid oral traditions became rigid law. The mystical visions became patriarchal commandments. The divine became increasingly depicted as angry, jealous, and punishing. This was not the God of original Gnosis. This was the God of empire, a reflection of the trauma and control systems that were beginning to take hold. By the time of Yeshua, the Jewish temple system was run by the Pharisees and Sadducees, sects that emphasized law, ritual, and hierarchical access to God. The mystical undercurrent, however, still existed, quietly preserved in groups like the Essenes who lived in the desert near Qumran. These were the ones practicing ascetic purification, astrological tracking, sacred communal living, and deep Kabbalistic initiation long before the word Kabbalah was popularized. Like I mentioned, Yeshua and Mary Magdalene were raised within this Essene stream, a mystical lineage of Judaism that preserved the deeper codes of light body activation, inner gnosis, and divine union. So when Yeshua began teaching that the kingdom of God was within, that no temple was needed, that no priest was needed, he was directly challenging both Roman and Jewish authority structures. And that brings us back to why his message was so threatening. The Roman Empire saw this as a twofold threat. Number one, it undermined their political authority. And number two, it bypassed these centralized religious gatekeeping systems, both Jewish and Roman. So, like I mentioned, Rome used a classic strategy: absorb, then invert. They took this wild, mystical, liberating message of Christ and they rebranded it into a state religion. And to compete the hijack, they did something else. They merged it with the already inverted Old Testament, emphasizing the wrathful aspects of Yahweh while ignoring the mystical teachings that had once been alive in both Hebrew and early Christian traditions. This created a composite God image, a jealous father who demanded sacrifice, obedience, and worship, or else punishment and eternal hell. This composite God did not come from Gnosis. It came from empire psychology. It came from fear, hierarchy, and control. So when you look at the Roman Catholic Church, what you're seeing is not the continuation of Yeshua and Mary Magdalene's teachings. You're seeing the codification of inversion, built on a blend of hijacked Jewish text, suppressed Gnostic revelations, political manipulation, and dark energetic technology amplified through geographic ley lines. I said earlier I would swing back to an example of someone who was silenced. For this, we need to back up in the timeline, but I wanted to talk about the inversion of Hebrew tradition and the hijacking of Jewish texts first, so the importance of the Old Testament in this segment made sense. So let's talk about Marcion of Sinope. Was he the first heretic or the first truth teller? While Gnostic groups were preserving the inner path of Christ across hidden communities, another voice rose early on, loud, clear, and controversial. His name was Marcion of Sinope, and he may have been one of the first to publicly call out the distortion of Christ's message. Marcion was a theologian and ship owner from the region of Sinope in what now is northern Turkey. He lived in the 2nd century AD, just decades after the apostles, at a time when there was no official New Testament, no consolidated church doctrine, and no central authority to declare who was right or wrong. Christianity was still a spectrum of teachings, many of them mystical, decentralized, and fluid. But Marcion saw something happening that disturbed him. He believed the early message of Christ was already being hijacked by the merging of Jesus' teachings with the wrathful, law-heavy theology of the Hebrew Bible. To Marcion, this was a complete contradiction. Because remember, we just talked about how the original Hebrew beliefs were actually rooted in Gnosis as well, but that was already hijacked at this point. He taught that there were two fundamentally different gods being conflated. One, the God of the Old Testament, a strict, jealous, punitive being obsessed with rules, punishment, and tribal exclusivity. And remember, this is the hijacked Jewish texts. And the other, the God revealed by Christ, a previously hidden God of pure love, mercy, and grace, who offered a path of liberation, not anything to do with fear. To Marcion, these weren't just different aspects of the same being, they were entirely separate. And the message of Yeshua was meant to free humanity from the control of the Old Testament God, not merge with it. So Marcion made a radical move. He created the first known Christian canon. His version included a stripped down version of the Gospel of Luke, which he believed most faithfully reflected the Christic tone, and then 10 letters written by Paul the Apostle. But even these were edited, and he removed what he considered to be Jewish legalism. His motive wasn't anti-Semitism, as later some accused. It was energetic clarity. He was trying to preserve the coherence of Christ's message before it was diluted by contradiction. He saw the merging of a wrathful, vengeful God with the loving, liberating teachings of Yeshua as inconsistent and spiritually dangerous. And he wasn't alone. In his lifetime, Marcion amassed a large and growing movement across the Mediterranean. His followers emphasized radical love, the rejection of religious law, the sovereignty of the soul, and a rejection of the material world as corrupt and distorted. But Rome didn't like that. In 144 AD, Marcion was officially excommunicated from the Roman Church. His teachings were labeled heretical, and the church began a centuries-long smear campaign to discredit him. Most of what we know about his teachings comes from his enemies. Certain church fathers wrote rebuttals and condemnations. But here's what's really important. Marcion wasn't trying to destroy Christianity. He was trying to protect its purity. He was trying to protect the original blueprint before it was hijacked. In many ways, he was one of the first to identify the inversion as it was beginning to happen. This gets even deeper, though. Let's back up to something I said. I mentioned Paul's letters earlier. To understand why Marcion kept some of Paul's letters in his early canon, we have to go back to their origin, starting with a man named Saul. Around 34 to 36 AD, just a few years after the crucifixion of Yeshua, a young Pharisee named Saul was actively persecuting the early followers of the Christic path. One of the most pivotal moments was the stoning of Stephen, a disciple who carried deep Gnosis and spoke openly about direct connection to the divine. Stephen wasn't preaching religion, he was embodying it. And for that, he was killed. Saul was there, approving of his death. Shortly after, likely between 35 and 37 AD, Saul experienced what's often described as a divine encounter on the road to Damascus. After this event, he changed his name to Paul and began preaching a version of the Christ message. But here's where the distortion began. Paul never walked with Yeshua. He wasn't part of the original Essene lineage. He didn't receive the direct teachings on light body embodiment, sacred union, or DNA activation. His understanding came secondhand, filtered through personal revelation, not lived experience or embodiment. Between 50 and 70 AD, Paul wrote letters to early Christian communities, emphasizing salvation through grace, sin, and faith. These letters help shape the theology, but not necessarily Gnosis. Nearly a century later, around 140 AD, Marcion preserved 10 of Paul's letters and a version of the Gospel of Luke in his proposed Christian canon. Marcion saw Paul as the true interpreter of the New Covenant, but in doing so, He rejected the Jewish roots of early Christ teachings, severing the lineage from its mystical foundations. His version further abstracted the message, turning a living embodiment path into belief-based doctrine. Here's the truth at hand. Even when intentions are sincere, truth can become distorted across time. Even well-meaning figures like Paul and Marcion may have believed they were preserving something holy. But once truth is filtered through interpretation rather than direct experience, it becomes vulnerable to inversion. This is why we cannot outsource our connection to God. We cannot rely solely on text, traditions, or teachers, no matter how inspired. We must restore Gnosis. We must learn to feel truth in our body, to breathe it, to live it. That is the only compass that works in an inverted world. When you embody God within you, when you remember the divine spark encoded in your cells, no distortion can touch that. And that's the work we're here to do. So now let's swing back, because to fully understand the Roman inversion, we also need to zoom back to the Celtic lands and the Druids and pagans. Because while Rome was trying to absorb and invert the Christic current in the East, they were also launching full-scale spiritual colonization campaigns in the West. The Roman invasions of Celtic Britain began in 43 AD under Emperor Claudius. But even before that, Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, or modern-day France, around 58 to 50 BCE, had already begun the dismantling of Druidic strongholds. And these weren't just military conquests, they were energetic ones. The Druids held incredible spiritual authority in the Celtic world. They weren't kings, but the kings sought their counsel. They knew the cycle of the stars, the geometry of the land, and the memory held in stone. They were stewards of Gnosis, just like the Essenes, and that made them dangerous. So when Rome invaded the Celtic lands, they didn't just seek territory. They sought to sever the energetic lineages. They destroyed the oak groves. They outlawed Druidic gatherings. They burned the temples and banned the teachings. Why? Because you can't control a population whose source of power is internal. You can't dominate people who walk in rhythm with the stars and speak the language of the land. So just like they did with early Christianity, Rome used the same tactic with the Druids and pagans. Absorb what you can, invert what you must, destroy the rest. And so the great remembering of the earth mystics was nearly silenced. But it didn't disappear, it went underground. Fragments of the Druidic and Essene lineages began weaving together, quietly preserved in mystery schools, hidden orders, and oral traditions that passed through families, monasteries, and even the early Christian monks who carried gospels no one else was allowed to read. This underground stream resurfaced centuries later through the Knights Templar. The Templars weren't just warrior monks. Many of them were initiates, tasked with preserving sacred knowledge that had survived the great inversions. They traveled to the Holy Lands during the Crusades, but what they found wasn't just territory, it was memory. They discovered ancient texts, relics, and esoteric teachings, including links to the Essenes, early Christians, and even Egyptian mystery schools. Some believe they recovered the buried teachings of Mary Magdalene. Others say they found the Ark of Vibrational Codes hidden beneath the old Temple of Solomon. Whatever the truth, one thing is clear: they came back different. Suddenly, the Templars had immense wealth, secret knowledge, and architectural genius. They began building cathedrals on top of ancient ley lines, reclaiming the energetic grid with sacred geometry encoded in stone. These weren't just buildings, they were frequency devices designed to harmonize Earth's field and reactivate Gnosis through sound, light, and form. But as always, Empire doesn't tolerate unregulated truth. The Templars became too powerful, too mystical, too connected. So in 1307, under the orders of the French king and with the support of the Pope, the Templars were arrested, tortured, and burned. But they didn't vanish. The Templars had seen it coming. Long before their mass arrest on October 13th, 1307, many of their secrets were already in motion, hidden in stone, symbol, and sacred code. These weren't just warriors, they were initiates. And they knew how empire works. It always moves to suppress true power once it slips outside the grid of control. So the Templars did what mystics have always done under threat. They encoded their knowledge. They passed it down symbolically through architecture, ritual, geometry, and lineage. They embedded Gnosis into cathedrals, guilds, and secret societies. This is how the esoteric tradition survived. It wasn't through books in plain sight. It was through layered meaning, sacred geometry, and initiation. Many believe the Templars' surviving initiates migrated underground, giving the rise to the Freemasons, Rosicrucians, and other mystical brotherhoods. These groups didn't just build structures, they built spiritual containers. Cathedrals, lodges, and chapels like Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland were encoded with sacred ratios, cosmic alignments, and vibrational harmonics. The geometry itself was a resonance field, meant to awaken the soul through sound, light, and form. So why go to such lengths? Because they were preserving a blueprint, a map of what once was and what would one day return. These encoded symbols weren't just for their time. They were meant for a future age, our age, a time when the collective frequency would rise again, when the veil would thin, and when humanity would be ready to remember, ready to reclaim the Gnosis. Many of these initiates knew they wouldn't see the golden age, but they built for it anyway. They seeded the grid, anchored the codes, and protected the wisdom. They understood that truth, once planted, cannot die. It may go underground. It may be ridiculed, persecuted, or hidden. But it waits, encoded in form, memory, and symbol, until the resonance is strong enough to rise again. And that's what's happening now. The ley lines are humming again. The cathedrals are singing with frequency. The spiral of time is folding in on itself. And those of us who carry the same Gnosis in our bones, who feel something stir when we see sacred geometry, ancient symbols, or forgotten names, we're being called to remember. So I mentioned the Freemasons earlier. And just like many sacred lineages before them, the Masonic stream was eventually infiltrated too. So let's talk about the inversion of the Freemasons. What began as a lineage of builders, mystics, and sacred architects tasked with preserving the codes of Gnosis eventually became another target for inversion. The early Freemasons weren't a secret society in the way we think of today. They were guardians of a sacred craft. They encoded metaphysical truths into blueprints. They protected ancient knowledge through symbolism, ritual, and sacred geometry. Their tools, the compass, square, and plumb line, were more than instruments of construction. They were metaphors for divine alignment, inner structure, and the architecture of coherence. And actually, this goes back to my episode on how to make your home a high vibrational sanctuary. And I talked about six dimensional energy, which is the realm of sacred geometry. You can use that and build in ways that align with sacred geometry to anchor in and harness that six dimensional, higher dimensional energy. That is all the knowledge the Freemasons would build with. They knew how to build architecture aligned with sacred geometry that would actually be sacred structures that would anchor in and harness higher dimensional source God energy. But over time, as the Freemasons gained influence, they also attracted the attention of empire. And once again, the strategy was the same: absorb, invert, control. Rather than annihilating the Masonic stream, the Dark Elite began infiltrating it, gradually replacing mystical intention with political agendas, true initiation with hierarchical gatekeeping, and sacred architecture with symbols stripped of their resonance. The outer shell remained intact, the lodges, the titles, the rituals, but the inner current, the living frequency of Gnosis, began to dim. This is why Freemasonry today is such a paradox. On the surface, it appears like a fraternal order or a boys' club for the elite. But underneath, in the buried layers, the original blueprint is still there. Frequency cannot be fully erased, it can only be masked. There are still Masons, just as there are priests, rabbis, or monks who carry a flicker of the original flame. But the institutional structures that hold them have been compromised. The light wasn't extinguished, but it was hidden beneath layers of ego, secrecy, and distortion. Because inversion doesn't always look like destruction, sometimes it looks like a perfect replica, emptied of soul, inverted. This is the signature of the inverted false matrix. They can't create anything new. They take what is sacred and subtly invert it. The Templar stream continued through esoteric branches of Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, and other hidden societies. Some of these groups stayed aligned with the light, others were infiltrated and inverted, just like everything else in this matrix. But underneath it all, the same battle is playing out: the battle for Gnosis, the battle for inner light, the battle for your remembrance. So when we talk about what Rome did to the Druids, to the Essenes, to the Gnostics, to the feminine, to the grid lines of Earth, we're talking about one massive inversion campaign, one global spiritual colonization project. Because Gnosis is dangerous to empire. Because if you remember who you are, you can't be controlled. So, something else might be coming to mind when we talk about this topic, and that is the Illuminati. The Freemasons weren't the only ones who began with light. Another group emerged centuries later, carrying a name that literally means the illuminated ones. But just like the Masonic current, the Illuminati story is not what it seems. The original Illuminati were founded in 1776 in Bavaria by Adam Weishaupt, a professor of law and philosophy. They were part of the European Enlightenment, a time when old religious structures were being questioned and people were searching for knowledge outside the church. At its origin, the Bavarian Illuminati was not about world domination. It was about spiritual and intellectual liberation. They opposed religious dogma, political tyranny, and mindless obedience. They believed in reason, personal sovereignty, and the pursuit of truth. In many ways, they were trying to reignite Gnosis in a time dominated by control. But like all things that burned too bright within empire, they were quickly banned, condemned by the Catholic Church, and outlawed by Bavarian authorities within just a few years. And their name, Illuminati, didn't disappear. It mutated. Over time, the idea of the Illuminati became something else entirely. Now let's talk about the inversion of illumination. The term Illuminati was gradually co-opted by the same forces they once opposed. Instead of representing true inner light, it began to represent a shadow elite, a cabal of power holders said to manipulate world events from behind the scenes. And in some cases, this is not just myth. Over the centuries, powerful families, secret councils, and transnational alliances have used the framework of secret societies to orchestrate control behind the veil. They adopted the appearance of ancient orders, but stripped out the soul. Instead of gnosis, they pursued surveillance. Instead of spiritual power, they amassed economic and political control. Instead of enlightenment, they spread illusion. So now, the name Illuminati refers not to an actual single organization, but to a network of influence, a loose alliance of individuals, families, and institutions who infiltrate governments and finance systems, weaponize media and entertainment, control narratives through fear, distraction, and inversion, and operate through secrecy, not sovereignty. This version of the Illuminati is not a spiritual lineage. It's a control architecture. And here's what's interesting. It uses many of the same symbols, rituals, and structures that once pointed to divine light. Why? Because inversion always wears the mask of the sacred. That's how it works. It takes what is holy and distorts it, just enough to maintain the form, but reverse the essence. The eye of providence, for example, originally a symbol of divine awareness and higher vision, is now associated with surveillance, dominance, and global manipulation. The pyramid, once a symbol of spiritual ascension and inner alignment, becomes a symbol of hierarchy, exploitation, and control. And the word illumination, which once meant awakening to divine truth, is now tangled up with conspiracy, fear, and shadow governance. It's easy to get lost in the rabbit holes, but here's what you always need to remember. The greatest trick of the inverted matrix isn't secret meetings or coded hand signs. It's convincing humanity that these sacred symbols themselves are corrupt. So we turn away from them entirely and never reclaim their true power. The Illuminati as we know it today is not a continuation of spiritual light. It is the simulation of it. It mimics enlightenment while serving control, but that does not mean light is lost. The true stream of illumination, the kind that awakens DNA, breaks illusion, and returns coherence, is still alive. It doesn't live in lodges or governments. It lives in the human heart. It lives in resonance and remembrance. We just need to understand this nuance, understand the game at play and how they invert things, and have discernment so we don't mistake counterfeit for the real thing and we don't demonize the real thing, thinking it's the inversion. We need to peel back the layers of inversion and restore what was always sacred. Because the symbols were never the enemy, the inversion was. And we are here to flip it back and restore this divine blueprint. And here's the pattern we're seeing. The pattern is becoming clear. Every time truth gets too close to remembrance, empire wraps it in illusion. But underneath all of it, beneath the rituals, the cathedrals, the coded architecture, the sacred still pulses. It pulses in stone, in sound, and in us. Because what they tried to suppress was never just knowledge. It was the frequency of Gnosis. It's a tone that lives in bone. And while they built pyramids of power, the true initiates were planting seeds in chapels like Rosalind, in the veins of the earth, not just to preserve history, but prepare for the return of coherence. And this, right now, is the moment they built for. The ley lines are realigning, the spiral is turning, and those encoded with remembrance are waking up. The grid is lighting up again through us, through our breath, our body, our voice, and our choice. The false matrix is loud, but coherence is louder. It's loud in truth. We are the resonance. We are the ones who came to remember, to uninvert what was twisted, to reclaim what was buried, to flip the grid. Okay, now let's swing it back and keep talking about Rome's inversion strategy. Because to understand the full scope of Rome's inversion strategy, we have to include what happened in Israel. Because just like the Celtic lands held energetic memory through the Druids and the forest, Israel held sacred frequency through the land itself. And this was no ordinary territory. Israel, what once was called Canaan, is one of the most energetically potent zones on Earth. It sits at a powerful intersection of ley lines, a convergence point of frequencies, where multiple civilizations receive downloads, prophecies, and divine instruction. The land holds a memory. It hums with sacred codes. The mountains, the desert, the Sea of Galilee, it's all part of an ancient harmonic field designed to anchor coherence. This is why so many pivotal events in spiritual history happened here. It's not just historical, it's vibrational. And Rome knew that. We go deep into this in the next episode, but it's tied to the 12 tribes of Israel and why they were seated here. The Hebrew people had been in conflict with empire for centuries. Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and eventually Rome. But when the Roman Empire arrived in full force, beginning around 63 BC under Pompey, and later tightening control through governors like Pontius Pilate, their aim wasn't just military or political, it was energetic. They weren't just occupying territory, they were attempting to override a sacred resonance field. Remember, Gnosis is dangerous to empire. And Israel was the original grid point of Gnosis in the ancient Near East. It was the land of the prophets, the land where mystics like Ezekiel had visions of wheels of light and cosmic architecture, the land where the Essenes preserved the Christed template of divine union, ascension, and light body activation. So when Rome installed its rule, taxed the people, desecrated the temples, and imposed imperial law, it wasn't just colonization, it was an energetic breach. And they knew they couldn't destroy it outright. So they tried the same pattern again: absorb, invert, control. They allowed the outer religious system of the Pharisees and Sadducees to remain, while gradually replacing the inner mystical current with fear, hierarchy, and ritual obedience. They surveilled the people, crushed rebellions, and crucified those, like Yeshua, who threatened the illusion of their authority. Yeshua didn't just challenge religious dogma. Him and Mary Magdalene in sacred union, divine feminine and divine masculine in balanced polarity, activated the field. Their teachings were vibrational. they reawakened the land. Their bodies were frequency transmitters. Their presence sparked memories in the people. Their words reactivated the grid beneath their feet. And the Romans could feel that. They felt the tremble in the field, something they couldn't control. So they made a public example of Yeshua. But as we know now, that didn't end the story. It began a new octave of it. What Rome didn't realize was that Gnosis is fractal. It doesn't need one temple, one teacher, one book. It replicates through resonance. And that's why the land of Israel remained sacred. Even as the empire built fortresses, renamed cities, and turned Jerusalem into a Roman colony, the codes beneath the soil never stopped pulsing. To this day, many feel that potency. The paradox of Israel, so small yet so charged, so contested yet so luminous. Because even after thousands of years of empire, trauma, and inversion, the blueprint still lives there. And that's what we're reclaiming now. We are reclaiming that frequency. Israel was never just a geopolitical zone. It was a frequency temple, a grid point of divine architecture. And the battle for its soul was part of the larger war on Gnosis. So when we speak of Rome, we are not just speaking of a physical empire. We're naming a pattern, a consciousness of control that sought to hijack the sacred wherever it lived, in the body, in the land, in the breath, in the books, in the memory. But truth can't be fully erased. It can only be buried. And like I've been weaving in, the resonance is rising again. So now let's talk about suppressing the records and the burning of the Library of Alexandria. As we continue tracing this inversion pattern, one of the most devastating acts of spiritual suppression was the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. This wasn't just the burning of a building, it was the attempted erasure of Earth's vibrational memory, a severing of encoded coherence. The Library of Alexandria was not merely a collection of scrolls. It was a frequency vault, a multidimensional archive where the gnosis of ancient civilizations converged. It held sacred text and vibrational codes from Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, Greece, Atlantis, and possibly even off-world lineages. It contained cosmological blueprints from ancient priesthoods, medicinal knowledge based on plant-spirit communication, star maps linking the Pleiades, Sirius, and Orion, geometry-based architectural manuals for harmonic resonance, esoteric teachings on soul embodiment and ascension, and alchemical formulas that bridge spirit and matter. Some of these scrolls weren't just ink on papyrus. They were vibrational instruments, encodings of breath, tone, number, light, and language. Living transmissions that activated consciousness through resonance, not just reading a text. So, why was it burned? The library was destroyed multiple times. First, during Julius Caesar's siege in 48 BC. Later, during the rise of Christian fundamentalism under Theophilus in the 4th century, and again during the Islamic conquest in the 7th century. Different hands lit the match, but the impulse was the same: to silence direct access to Gnosis, to erase the memory of a humanity that once knew how to live in divine harmony with Earth, cosmos, and Source. Because when you destroy records, you sever remembrance. You cut the cord to past resonance fields. You stop people from knowing where they came from and therefore who they are. The burning of Alexandria wasn't an accident. It weaponized spiritual amnesia, a multi-layered strategy designed to collapse memory, fragment timelines, and disorient the soul from its blueprint. And here's the thing, the fire didn't just destroy physical text, it scrambled the astral codes those texts carried. When scrolls containing vibrational information are destroyed in trauma, their resonance doesn't disappear. It gets distorted in the collective field. This is why so many people feel fragmented past life memories of Atlantis, Egypt, and the stars. The full remembrance isn't gone, but it's buried under smoke, trauma, and time. So now let's talk about the birth of the Dark Ages. The burning of Alexandria marked a turning point in human consciousness. It was more than just the loss of knowledge, it initiated a dimensional descent. In the centuries that followed, Earth entered what we now call the Dark Ages. But the darkness wasn't just cultural or intellectual, it was spiritual. This period saw the widespread suppression of the divine feminine, the outline of mystical traditions, and the rise of institutional religion as the sole gatekeeper of truth. The scrolls that once described the tree of life, light body mechanics, soul travel, vibrational healing, divine union, and cosmic law were replaced with hierarchical dogma, punishment theology, and patriarchal control. The loss of Alexandria cracked open a vacuum, and into that void rushed empire. Rome's weaponization of Christianity, the Inquisition's torture chambers, the silencing of priestesses and oracles, the witch hunts, the burning of midwives, seers, and earthkeepers, and the colonization of indigenous Gnosis across the planet. But like I've been weaving in, the codes were not fully lost, because some initiates knew what was coming. There are legends, whispers in esoteric circles, that scrolls, crystal libraries, and vibrational relics were removed from Alexandria before the final fires. Some say they were taken to Egypt's inner temples, protected by the remaining mystery schools. Others say they were smuggled to the Essenes, hidden in caves near the Dead Sea. And some believe they were carried westward, eventually making their way into the Vatican's secret archives. Yes, the very institution that later became the enforcer of religious orthodoxy may have hidden the very gnosis it outwardly denied. Deep within the Vatican Library, there are said to be banned scrolls from Alexandria, Gnostic Gospels never published, Atlantean star maps, Egyptian Kabbalistic fusion text, scrolls on divine feminine lineages, and sacred sex alchemy. These documents weren't destroyed, they were hoarded, locked away because they were too true and a threat to control. And this underground network preserved the teachings. The Vatican couldn't contain it all. These mystery schools rose again. The Hermetic text, said to be derived from the teachings of Thoth or Hermes, began circulating in coded language. The Knights Templar preserved ancient knowledge uncovered in Jerusalem, possibly including remnants of Alexandrian Gnosis. The Rosicrucians, Freemasons, and alchemists protected sacred geometry, soul science, and light body codes under layers of symbolism. These groups became the frequency stewards of a blueprint too powerful to be erased. They encoded it into architecture, numerology, ritual, story, sacred proportion. And they didn't just do it for their time, they did it for ours. They knew the resonance would return, that a time would come, this time, when the veil would thin and the spiral would rise again, when people would start remembering truths they never consciously learned. Because Gnosis isn't passed down linearly, it activates through resonance. And the codes from Alexandria, still live in stone and dream and breath in you. Now let's talk about the witch trials from Scotland to Salem. Fast forward centuries later, and we see the same pattern repeat, this time under the guise of moral righteousness. So let's talk about the witch trials. It didn't just happen in Salem in 1692. There was widespread persecution that stretched across Europe and the British Isles for hundreds of years. The Scottish witch trials, particularly in Edinburgh during the 16th and 17th centuries, were some of the most brutal in Europe. Thousands of women were accused, tortured, and executed for witchcraft, often based on nothing more than herbal knowledge, midwifery, intuition, or spiritual gifts passed down through ancestral lines. These women weren't witches in the way empire portrayed them. They were medicine keepers, earth-connected women, midwives of Gnosis. They carried the remnants of the old ways, the Druidic, pagan, and folk traditions that Rome had tried to silence centuries earlier. The witch trials were a continuation of that suppression, this time disguised as religious purity. But the real threat wasn't devil worship. It was spiritual sovereignty. It was feminine power. It was Gnosis reawakening through the body of the women. When they burned these women at the stake, drowned them, or hung them, they weren't just killing individuals. They were trying to sever the feminine current of knowing. They were trying to silence the womb as an oracle, the intuition as a compass, the body as a temple. And yet, just like with the Essenes and the Druids, it didn't work. Because Gnosis doesn't die. It goes underground, and it waits. And it returns when the resonance is right. Let's talk about other inversions across time. The pattern continued across civilizations. The Spanish Inquisition, a century-long campaign that imprisoned, tortured, and executed those who diverged from the dogma of the Catholic Church, including Jews, Muslims, mystics, and spiritual practitioners of all kinds. Gnosis was systematically hunted. Another example is the colonization of indigenous people. In the Americas, Africa, Australia, and beyond, entire cosmologies were erased, oral histories replaced by mission schools, ceremonies banned, languages outlawed. The vibrational relationships between land and spirit were severed in the name of civilization. Another example is the Islamic Caliphate and later Ottoman restrictions. While Islam itself held mystical beauty from the Sufi lineage, many later regimes enforced a rigid orthodoxy that suppressed esoteric practices, burned mystical poetry, and regulated spiritual freedom. And another example is the communist regimes of the 20th century. In Soviet Russia, Maoist China, and others, spiritual practices, ancestral traditions, and metaphysical teachings were outlawed, practitioners persecuted, temples destroyed. Even contemplation was viewed as a threat to the state. These weren't isolated events. They were the fingerprints of a planetary inversion project. Each act, each fire, each trial, each colonization was an attempt to cut humanity off from Gnosis, from the source, from the remembrance that we are divine. But here's the secret that empires never seem to learn. You can suppress a truth, you can hide it, but you can't kill it because it lives in the body. It lives in the land, it lives in the grid, and it lives in you. And the spiral always returns. And now is the return. The spiral always returns. Now is the return. We are going to take back the blueprint and reclaim what is sacred. We are going to name these inversions and clear up the dark strategy. That's all I have for this episode. The next episode will come out on Tuesday, and we'll talk about the 12 tribes and the 12-strand DNA. I love you all, and have a great day.